When we look through the history of serial killers, we see a pattern that stalked, waited, and took risk. We see something that unites them all, and that's their instruments of death. From their hands, to a crowbar, to an ice pick. Most serial killers are particular about how they murder their victim. Looking through some of history's most notorious and brutal murderers, many of them are different from looks, education, but share the same sickness, the need, the want from their victim. Most of the time, it's more than just assaulting the victim. It's control, torture, dismemberment of the body, keeping trophies, from the famous to the not so well known. Let's see what their murder method is. Most serial killers, they don't have a history of using firearms on their victims. It defeats the whole purpose of their passion, their desire, and most of the time, when a serial killer has a victim, guns are far too quick and humane for their victims, but there are exceptions for some. When we do look at firearms, there's one that stands out among them all, and that's Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker of California. Richard's whole situation is unique for any serial killer. Richard would use guns, knives, or just an object if he had to. But the main reason we see this with Richard is because the majority of Richard's victims, he had to be quick. He would sneak into people's homes at night, walking from house to house, from window to window, peeking inside, late in the night, until he walked up on a window that was unlocked, and he would simply climb in. Richard Ramirez's crime scenes, till this day, are some of the most gruesome that you will ever see amongst serial killers. They're messy, they're foul, they're things of nightmares. Ed Kemper was another serial killer that used many forms on his victims. Ed Kemper has a very low count when it comes to the number of being one of the most famous serial killers in history, but he's one of the most honest you'll find. Ed would use a rifle in his first murders, murdering his grandparents at a very young age. But when he started taking the lives of co-eds in California, this is where Ed drifts away from rifles to something else. Ed was more on the unusual side for a serial killer. Ed was more or less looking for a body more than the thrill of taking life. Ed is simply after something else. His interests lie in necrophilia, dismemberment, and possession of parts of the body. His goal is to get there as fast as possible. When Ed is taking the lives of co-eds, he uses weapons to scare people. A knife, a gun, but will also carry handcuffs with him to trap his victims. In his 1969 Ford Galaxy 500, you can say that Ed's car was a part of his murder weapons as well. It was used as a trap for his victims. He would lock them in it, knowing they could not escape the passenger side door because he's rigged it to not open. Once they were inside, they could not open the door. And this is simply how Ed trapped his victims and kept his victims. Maybe your killer is a respected doctor you trust to take care of you, or your family member. Dr. Harold Shipman is one of many doctors that have started murdering patients throughout history, but Dr. Shipman has taken the lives of so many victims, it's still not even known how many he has taken. His count lies between 200 to 300. He worked at a little town right outside of Manchester. Shipman would do many home visits with his patients that were mostly elderly and by themselves. This would go on for over 20 years with Shipman, picking and choosing who lives and who dies. Many of his victims were found in their homes, just sitting there, in their chair or bed, with tea beside them, remote in their hand, just looking peacefully like they passed in their sleep. But sadly, they were visited by Shipman. Shipman would give a very heavy dose of morphine choosing this as his weapon for taking life. But the tools that helped the doctor were his life. He was a doctor with training, paperwork, degrees. He was married with children. He was living in a small town where he was respected and loved. His community adored him. But like most serial killers, he knows this, and he's preying on people around him. The one little item that always ends up in the hands or in the head of victims is the ice pick. The toolbox killers were famous for the ice pick. They used it for torturing their victims, jabbing their victims in the legs, the hands, for no reason, just for pure torture and the sadness of their victim. Ted Bundy also used the ice pick. He never really talked about it, whether he didn't want to talk about it or just bashful about it. But when he was pulled over in Utah in 1975, something happened, something that we do not get to see a lot of the time. Ted is found with his murder kit on him. He's pulled over. The police officer has no idea who he is. When they go through his bag of murder weapons, they find an ice pick, gloves that don't match, a flashlight, a mask. They find a thick belt. They find trash bags. More than likely this was to keep the heads of his victims wrapped up until he could get them where he wanted them. Rope is another item almost every serial killer has or used on victims at some point. John Gacy was a killer that openly used rope to strangle his victims, giving very detailed accounts about how he tied it, used it, and how long it took. But a killer using rope is becoming more intimate for the killer. It's time-consuming, it's vile, it's torture. It tells a lot about the killer. And in most cases, seeing rope used, bringing someone to be unconscious, it's the favorite part for the killer. They're not interested in the corpse, they're just interested in the actual taking of life. This is why the number one item we see are the hands of a killer. It's a very intimate element for the killer, looking into the eyes of their victim. Strangulation by hands is even more common in homosexual serial killers. Most of the time, if not all the time, death will come by strangulation. When looking through the history of homosexual serial killers, men being the dominant predator, there's many to look at. Randy Kraft is one of those men, a homosexual serial killer that killed 16 young men, strangling them to death. He's one of many that are just simply wanting to do one thing, strangle someone to death. Dennis Nilsen is almost a repeat, almost the exact same killer, but just a different country, different time. He would lure young men back to his home, enticing them with drinks, money, and then slipping something a little extra in their drinks, leaving them to be unconscious, and Dennis placing his hands around their neck to where they would never wake up again. Even as sadistic and sick as it all sounds, it can progress into something even worse. Dean Corll, in many people's opinion, is one of the most sadistic killers in U.S. history. His crimes are almost too detailed and torturous to even talk about. His nickname is the Candyman. Scary and simple facts of Dean's life and his crimes is that Dean lived in a nice suburb, a neighborhood full of children and families. Dean was known and respected. He had a home all to himself. No one ever saw or suspected a thing. Dean would start abducting young boys around the neighborhood and around town. He would keep them locked up in a bedroom in his home. He would chain them to a board and have his way with them, assaulting them non-stop. He would even be able to manipulate young men to luring other young men to his home. Dean would even have situations where he would abduct two boys, chaining them to the same board, leaving loud music blaring during the day while Dean went to work, making a promise to the boys, saying, "If one of you kills the other one, I'll let the winner go." The two boys that were hooked to the board just beat each other all day until Dean came home and would still assault them that day. It got to the point around Dean's neighborhood that literally every 4 to 8 houses apart, children were missing throughout the neighborhood. From Dean luring them in his home, to his young henchmen luring them in the house. He took the lives of at least 30 young men. Dean would torture, strangle, shoot, and beat his victims. Dean would even electrocute the private parts of his victims. He would even pull the pubic hair out of his victims, one by one, as they were still alive, hooked to the board. But Dean's story would come to an end in a shocking way. One of Dean's main helpers, Wayne Henley, would mess up and make Dean furious, almost costing Henley his life in a terrible way. Henley said he had just had enough, and honestly, he was running out of people to bring to Dean, but he knew his neighbor girl. She was having a rough day, and Henley talked her into coming over to a friend's house, an older friend, where they could relax, drink, partake in certain things. But a friend of the girls would also come, who was a young boy. So when they get to Dean's house, Dean sees the boy, but he also sees the young girl. Dean becomes furious, but as most serial killers do, they transition and take control. Dean calms himself down, sits the two at the kitchen table, and essentially chloroform them, holding rags over their nose. When they come to, they'll be in the room of torture. They'll see the board. They'll be tied to posts. Dean is naked. He's telling Henley, "I want you to shoot the girl, and everything will be fine." Henley agrees. Dean unties him. When Henley stands up, he grabs the gun, and he starts shooting Dean. Dean will fall in his hallway naked and die right there in his own home. And in the end, only 2 young men will be left to tell the unbelievable stories of what Dean did to his victims and what he had these 2 young men do for him. Even years later, Dean's old house, it's starting to be looked over again. Authorities as of late are digging in the backyard, looking for bones, looking for clothes. There's whispers that there's victims still in the backyard, and Dean's house in Texas still stands with mysteries around it. Looking at women that have become serial killers, women generally stick to just a few short methods of murdering their victims. We see guns being used as one of the main items by women. Elaine Wuornos is still one of the most famous women serial killers to this day, luring men into the woods or on back roads with the promise of selling herself to them. She simply then shoots them and will rob them, taking their vehicle and whatever cash they have on them. Poison is another big element we see. It's highly used among women that are killing more than just one person, whether they're just killing husband after husband or just people they're taking care of, looking like a good Samaritan. We do see knives in the hands of women, but more than not, knives, when they're used by women, they're more of crimes of passion, women that are furious, angry. But when it comes to the crime and passion of just taking life, Gary Ridgway is a serial killer that has murdered, some think, at least 100 women, most of which he would use his bare hands. It's crazy to think a man could do this to so many women, not being bothered. Gary even said, when he was caught and asked about the crimes, Gary simply said he thought since he was taking the lives of prostitutes, the police would be happy with him. They wouldn't be that upset. He thought he was helping the police clean up the streets. But his life, apart from killing, was his strength. Gary was married, a loving husband, a wonderful husband, as his ex-wife would say. He had a wonderful job, a good paying job, a nice home, well respected, had friends. He was loved by many. Serial killers are interesting creatures. They all have a hard work ethic when it comes to stalking and murdering. And some of them, if not most of them, they have jobs, careers, marriages, children. They're involved in church. They're respected. They keep to themselves. They compartmentalize their life into different areas. Serial killers are still out there today among us, living normal lives to their neighbors. They might even be watching this, taking notes, and seeing how far their colleagues took their own desires. But friends, until next time, check your windows, check your doors, and remember, be careful who you get into the car with.